In the year 89 BCE, behind the tall white walls of a Roman senator's private courtyard, a young noblewoman named Julia Vtoria screamed, not from guilt, but from defiance. She had not betrayed the state nor her marriage. Her only crime was asking a question. For that, Rome gave her pain. Her wrists were bound, her legs forced into a strange wooden arc. She was stripped and strapped without trial. The senators called it necessary. The slaves whispered another word, horror. This wasn't punishment for a thief or traitor. This was a message carved in wood and leather, meant only for women who spoke too boldly. A new kind of device built not to punish a crime, but to break a wife. And Rome didn't hide it. They polished it. They admired it. They named it after the woman it first touched. What began as one man's cruelty was now an elegant invention. But Julia didn't shatter the way they wanted. Not at first. Because even when they bent her body, they couldn't quite bend her spirit. And in the empire's hunger to silence one woman, they gave her something even more dangerous than freedom, an audience. The evening was just beginning to fall over Rome when the sound of footsteps echoed down the long marble hall. Julia Vtoria, still barefoot, was sitting with a half-finished cup of wine when 4 slaves appeared. They kept their eyes down, hands shaking slightly. None of them gave a reason. One simply murmured, "He requests your presence." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She already knew why. Earlier that afternoon, in full view of the household, Julia had refused to follow a simple order from her husband. He had asked her to drink a bitter-tasting herb. When she asked what it was, he replied it was to cleanse the womb. Julia looked him straight in the eyes and said no. Her voice didn't shake. That quiet moment afterward felt louder than any shout. Her defiance, so calm and clear, was the wound he couldn't ignore. Now she was being led to the house's punishment chamber. As she walked through the dim halls, she smelled something strange, smoke. Not from fire, but from wood being heated. Inside the darkened room, her husband stood next to a strange object she'd never seen before. It looked like half of a barrel, smooth and curved, with leather straps hanging off the sides. "This," he said in a quiet, flat voice, "is to help you remember where you belong." He didn't summon a torturer. He called in a carpenter, the same one who crafted furniture for the villa. Then he told the slaves to strip her. That's when Julia fought back, but she was outnumbered. The straps closed over her body, tight across her shoulders, legs, and ankles. The wood pressed into her spine. Her back bent unnaturally. She couldn't scream. Not in front of them. Her mouth stayed shut. The pain was strange, slow, creeping in like the deep ache from standing too long, but deeper. Her hips began to throb. Her shoulders burned. Still, she wouldn't cry out. Her pride wouldn't let her. Her husband turned to the carpenter and spoke like he was ordering a chair. "Name this one after her," he said. The carpenter blinked. "You mean the device?" "Yes," the man replied. "I want her name on it." The device broke her body that night, but not her will. Not yet. She stayed locked in silence, refusing to give them what they wanted. In the shadows, one of the younger slaves dropped his torch. Everyone flinched. The only sounds were the crackling of fire and Julia's shallow breathing. Her face didn't turn away. She stared straight at her husband. And then, though she couldn't move, she smiled. It wasn't soft. It wasn't warm. It was the cold, bitter smile of someone who still had something left to fight with. Her husband saw it. And in that moment, it wasn't her earlier defiance he decided to punish. It was that smile. They called it refined. That was the first lie. When the carpenter revealed the completed design, polished to a soft shine and shaped like something harmless, a cradle or a chair, the senators praised its elegance. They admired how neatly the leather straps tucked away, how the wood was curved like sculpture. But Julia, still aching and fevered from her first night inside it, knew the truth. It wasn't beautiful. It was a weapon dressed up like furniture. It didn't slice or tear. It didn't need to. There were no sharp edges, no chains, no blood. Just a bend of the spine so unnatural it whispered into your nerves, into your joints, until your body screamed even if your mouth didn't. Her husband called it a corrective. He claimed it came from old Etruscan rituals, or perhaps borrowed from the Greeks, used on wild wives. But this was no tradition. This was something new. It was designed to break you slowly. Days later, Julia lay on a flat mat with linen wrapped around her shoulders. Every small movement sent waves of pain through her joints. Her shoulder felt like it was on fire. Still, she hadn't made a sound in front of him. That silence, that one quiet act of pride, cost her more than just pain. The carpenter returned the next morning. This time he brought parchment and ink. He sketched from memory, every strap, every curve. Julia watched from behind a thin curtain. She wasn't given privacy, just a shred of modesty in the form of shadow. Her aching body was being studied, tested, turned into a design, a prototype. The next model would be stronger, reinforced with iron. It would have a lock for the neck, holes for the knees, places for the bones to sink deeper, settle harder. Her husband had already sent letters to another magistrate. "She taught me how to make them yield," he'd written. That sentence cut worse than the bruises. She wasn't even a wife anymore. She was a manual, a method. Word spread through the noble circles, though no one spoke her name. Not in public. They called her only the First. In whispered corners of bathhouses and in the private chambers of brothels, powerful men who struggled to control their wives whispered about this new tool. Not about Julia, about the thing her body had helped them build. When Julia's fever finally broke, she asked the slave girl for water. The girl was quiet but obeyed. She poured gently, never looking her in the eyes. After a moment, the girl whispered, "They watched." Julia blinked. "The master?" The girl shook her head, barely speaking. "3 others." They were there. They laughed. The cup slipped from Julia's hand. Water soaked into the mat beneath her, but she didn't move. Her face gave nothing away, not yet. Her muscles were still too sore. Her legs could barely hold her weight. But something in her mind had begun to clear. Somewhere nearby, blueprints were being copied again. Somewhere else, another woman had just dared to question her place. And soon, another scream would echo beneath Roman stone. Julia couldn't stop what had been set in motion. But she could remember every face that smiled while she suffered. And if Rome wanted a show, they would get one. One they'd never forget. The room buzzed with soft voices and spilled wine. Golden light from oil lamps flickered across smooth marble columns, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Julia stood behind a silk curtain, her breath tight in her chest, wrists shaking slightly. They had washed her, dressed her, painted her face. But not for comfort, for spectacle. Her husband's voice rang out from the atrium. He was entertaining guests tonight. Senators, officials, men with gold rings and heavy laughter. They drank like conquerors, and none of them brought their wives. At the center of the room stood the new device. It was taller now, refined. The curved wood had been reinforced with iron ribs, metal clasps gleaming in the firelight. A carved step had been added for forced kneeling. They called it Disciplinaria Vtoria, Victorian discipline. No one dared say her name aloud, but everyone glanced toward the curtain. A steward pulled it open. Julia stepped into the light. No one dragged her this time. That was part of the performance, the illusion that she came of her own will. Her stomach churned. Her knees trembled, but she walked forward. Not for them, for herself. They wouldn't see fear in her face. Not tonight. The air shifted as she neared the device. Conversation slowed. Cups paused mid-air. One man licked his lips. Another chuckled under his breath. Her husband motioned for her to continue. She stopped briefly. A young slave girl knelt beside her, unfastened her belt, and let her stola fall to the floor. The room inhaled as one. Julia didn't blink. She stepped forward. The polished wood was cool against her knees. The straps closed around her thighs, her wrists, her neck. Her head was pulled down. Her spine curved until every breath felt like a battle. The ache in her ribs returned like a memory. The quiet scream in her shoulders built again. But she didn't make a sound. Her husband lifted his wine. "Observe," he said. Defiance corrected. "Order restored," laughter followed. Toasts clinked. One senator dropped a coin on the table and said, I wager she breaks before the second hour. More laughter. Julia couldn't see their faces, but she felt their eyes, cold, curious, hungry. The fire cracked beside her, its warmth sharp against her skin. Sweat trickled down her cheek. She was no longer a wife. She was an example, a lesson, a performance. Time passed slowly. A senator leaned in and asked, "Can she speak?" Her husband smirked. "Only if you untie her." The room roared with laughter. Julia's jaw locked. Her muscles burned. She didn't scream. Not when they threw dried fruit at her feet. Not when one man stepped forward and touched her back like it was part of the furniture. Not when someone said, "So quiet now." She remained still, and when the last guest finally left, when the wine was gone and the lamps had dimmed, someone came to release her. Her arms had gone numb. Her knees were bruised. Her mouth was bleeding where she'd bitten down to keep from crying out. But she stood up on her own. Her legs were shaking. Blood ran down her lip. Yet when she looked at her husband, her eyes were colder than the stone beneath her feet. He looked at her, smug, satisfied. Did they enjoy it? Julia wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Then she smiled, just barely. "Next time," she said, voice low, "let me choose the music." The whispers started first, quiet murmurs in marketplaces and noble halls. The device, once hidden in private villas and talked about only behind closed doors, had begun to move outward. At first, it was brought into courtrooms under the name of discipline, then to smaller arenas near the edge of the river. People no longer whispered about it. They lined up to see it. They no longer used women like Julia, wives of senators or daughters of wealthy merchants. That would have caused scandal. Instead, they chose slaves, orphans, women accused of disrespecting gods or breaking petty laws. Some hadn't even done that. One widow had simply spoken too loudly in a temple. The law called it re-education. The crowd called it a show. Julia sat under a pale linen canopy, the sun burning quietly through the fabric above her. Before her, a girl barely 16 was being bound to a newer version of the device. This one was taller, harsher, reinforced with iron. There were small holes in its frame, openings designed for tools, clamps, or something worse. The girl had stolen bread. That was her crime. But everyone knew they weren't there for justice. They were there for the sound. It wasn't pain they craved. It was the exact moment when a woman stopped resisting, when her strength faded, and her cries fell into that awful, hollow silence. Julia's stomach turned. Her jaw locked. She hadn't wanted to come. But her husband insisted. He sat beside her in a shaded box with other officials. They passed wine back and forth. One pointed out the new adjustments with pride. Another laughed when the girl begged. Julia didn't speak. She didn't flinch. But something inside her began to slip. Not her mind, her patience, her ability to pretend. That same week another message came. This time it wasn't a punishment. It was a request. The governor wanted a demonstration, a reenactment from the original subject, a polite way of saying the woman who made the cradle famous. She was promised safety, clean robes, guards to escort her. No pain, they said, but Julia understood the truth. They didn't want to hurt her body anymore. They wanted to break what was left of her dignity. When the messenger finished speaking, Julia looked up and asked, "Will I be allowed to speak to the crowd?" He paused, confused. "A statement," she added. "If they want the woman, they should hear her too," he said he would ask. 2 days later, she stood at the edge of an open-air theater just beyond the city walls. This wasn't the Colosseum, not yet, but it was close enough. The crowd welcomed her like a performer, not with jeers, but with fascination. Some clapped. Others leaned forward in silence. They didn't hate her. They were curious about whether a woman who once bent like a whip could still stand tall. In the center stood the device. Its metal surface shimmered under the sun. Julia walked toward it slowly, brushing her fingers across the straps. She didn't kneel, she didn't bow. She turned to the crowd and laughed. It rang out, sharp and sudden, rising through the arena like a trumpet. The guards flinched. The crowd shifted. Some laughed with her, unsure. Others didn't know what to do. But something had cracked. In that flash of sound, the illusion shattered, not just of the cradle, but of control. They had wanted obedience. What they got was a woman laughing at the thing meant to destroy her by the next morning. Her name was everywhere, not whispered in cautious corners or passed between servants, but spoken boldly, written in chalk on stone walls, carved into wood at market stalls. She was no longer Julia Vtoria, the senator's unruly wife. Now she was the woman who laughed on the cradle. The guards couldn't stop it. They tried, pulling down messages, chasing away street performers who mimicked her pose. But the story had already grown legs. In alleyways and bakeries, beggars repeated her words. A scribbled image of her appeared near the lower forum, hair wild, mouth wide in laughter. No one knew who drew it, but they all knew who it was. The cradle, designed to silence, had created a voice too loud to ignore. Her husband didn't speak to her for 3 days, not out of mercy. He was calculating. In his world, power came through fear, control, appearances. But now people mocked him. They whispered that his wife made a joke of the cradle, that she was stronger than the device, that she left the room laughing while he stood silent. Every silence became a threat, so when the summons came from the palace, from the emperor's own representative, Julia wasn't surprised. They didn't ask for punishment. They asked for a test. She was to appear at the court, not behind closed doors, before an audience. Nobles, senators, foreign dignitaries. They wanted to see if it was true. Could a Roman wife humiliate power and survive? The chamber was colder than any she had entered. Dark stone walls, veined black marble under her feet, and statues of broken goddesses lined the edges, their arms shattered, their eyes hollow. At the far end stood a man with soft hands and a polished smile, the emperor's voice. He greeted her with a nod. "This isn't a performance," he said. "It's a chance to apologize." Julia raised her chin. "Then why gather an audience?" Behind him, nobles sat in silence, their wives hidden behind gauze veils. Even foreign ambassadors had come, their robes whispering as they leaned forward. And in the center of the chamber, glinting under torchlight, stood a new version of the cradle. This one was beautiful, gold-trimmed, dyed leather, smooth as sculpture. It wasn't just a tool now. It was an exhibit, Neil, the man said softly. "Show them you remember your place." Julia stepped forward until her foot touched the base of the device. She looked at it, at the place where her knees would go, the straps that once held her breath still in her chest. But she didn't kneel. She turned slowly, letting her eyes meet every gaze in the room. "You built this," she said, calm but loud. "Not with wood, with silence. No one moved. You called it tradition, correction, balance, but it was always hunger. A hunger to break a woman and call it justice." One woman lowered her head. A senator shifted in his seat. Somewhere, someone held their breath. The official stepped closer. "You are not here to speak." Julia didn't blink. "Then why am I still standing?" No one answered. The room was no longer cold. It was shaking, not from her voice, but from the fear that someone like her might not be the last. And then, without asking permission, Julia turned her back to the cradle and walked away. Her footsteps echoed like a drumbeat, steady, defiant, alive. They say the cradle disappeared when Rome turned Christian, that it was destroyed, dismantled like the old idols, melted into coins or shattered into pieces no one cared to name. But that's only the story they recorded. The truth was quieter, slipped into the cracks between history books and temple scrolls. It hid in letters never meant for public eyes, in the journals of handmaids who never wrote their names, in the notes of physicians who treated women with dislocated joints and never asked how it happened. Julia Vtoria faded too, at least on paper. There was no record of her death, no burial, no headstone, no name carved in the family estate. Her lineage was scratched out, her story erased from household archives, but she was not gone. Not truly. She lived in the memories of those who saw her walk away from the thing built to destroy her. She survived in the admiration, quiet, terrified, but real, of the women who whispered her name only behind locked doors. The arenas moved on. The crowds found other ways to be entertained. Public beatings, imported animals, the slow suffering of heretics. But behind noble doors, in the high houses of those who still believed in control, the cradle didn't vanish. It simply changed. They hid it in new names. They softened it with language, called it therapy, or moral correction, or posture improvement. But it was still there, in the stiffened backs of women who flinched when kneeling, in the strange aches of wives who never learned where the bruises came from. By the 4th century, the whispers had returned, this time not in Rome, but in its far provinces. A bishop in Carthage condemned obscene instruments of posture in a letter to his clergy, though he never said what he meant. In Antioch, a scholar wrote of a moon-shaped device used to correct unruly widows. He described it in careful, almost admiring detail. It wasn't a moon, it was the cradle. By then, Julia had become a legend, a myth. Some said she was never real, just a tale told to frighten wives into silence. Others called her a martyr, though she'd never bled for any god. No one could agree who she was, but the women who believed in her didn't need to agree. They didn't debate her timeline or question her name. They passed her story like a relic, quietly, carefully, without letting men overhear. And when a woman somewhere, anywhere, stood up after being bent low, when she smiled through split lips or looked a man in the eye after being told to keep her gaze down, Julia rose again, not in fire, not in blood, but in the refusal to be small. In a small scroll found years later, blackened at the edges, nearly eaten by time, one sentence remained untouched. The handwriting was delicate, likely a woman's, steady and precise. It didn't mention names or dates. Just one line, clear and quiet. The machine taught them nothing. The silence did not last, and I am still laughing. No one could say for certain if Julia wrote it. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that someone remembered, that someone chose to put those words to paper, not as a scream, but as a warning. A breath before rebellion, a whisper meant to outlast empires. Even centuries after Julia vanished from public memory, the impact of what she did never fully faded. Every time a girl stood when told to sit, every time a woman lifted her voice in a room not meant to hear it, that spirit moved through her, not as legend, as legacy. Rome had tried to turn Julia into a cautionary tale, a warning about the cost of disobedience. But instead, they gave her something far more powerful, immortality, not in temples, not in stone, but in the quiet defiance of those who refused to forget her. The cradle had a purpose, to silence women, to teach them pain in place of voice. But it failed at its purpose the moment. Julia smiled inside it, because what Rome never understood is that you cannot destroy a woman who learns to turn her suffering into memory and her memory into fire. Even long after, the senators died and the empire collapsed into dust. That smile survived. That laugh echoed. It passed between women like a secret vow. And even as rulers came and went, as laws changed and punishments evolved, that memory remained. You cannot chain a voice once it has chosen to speak, and Julia Vtoria's voice, though nearly lost, never truly stopped speaking. Years slipped by. Rome shifted. Temples crumbled, emperors changed, and the cradle was said to be gone, lost to time like all the empire's dark toys. Some believed it was melted down, others claimed it had been burned in a purge of pagan relics. But that wasn't quite true. Its shape lived on, not in Rome's grand courts, but in shadows, in the tools disguised as medicine, in the methods dressed up as tradition. In every new name, they gave the old need to make women small. Sometimes a noble woman would flinch when asked to kneel. Her back would tense, her wrists would ache, and no one could explain why, but Julia lived in that pain. Not as a ghost, but as a memory smuggled between women too afraid to speak aloud. The story passed quietly, told between midwives, whispered in brothels, scribbled in the margins of forgotten scrolls. A woman who once laughed while bound. A woman who walked away from a room full of men who wanted her broken. By the time Christianity spread through the empire, Julia had already become something more than flesh. She was an idea, a warning. A smirk that history couldn't quite erase. Some said she never existed, that no senator's wife could have stood so strong. But the women who knew, who felt something burn in their chest when they heard the tale, never needed proof. They didn't worship her. They didn't weep for her. They carried her, because every time a woman stood up straighter, even when her back ached, every time she smiled through clenched teeth or refused to bow when ordered to, Julia rose again, not in statues or sermons, not in laws or victories, but in defiance and in one final, fragile truth. If we do not speak their names, history will bury them again, scrub them from stone, silence their memory, and call obedience peace. So we remember Julia, not as a martyr, not even as a hero, but as a woman who chose to laugh in the face of power and made the whole empire hear it.